That's a yes. Fantastic.
Perfect.
Good. Okay. I'm going to tell everyone to stop talking. Order in the court. We are very happy that our next speaker has arrived. And so we're going to hear from Dr. Michael Diamond Hunter, talk to us about race and ethnicity as disordered concepts and their ramifications for genomic research. As we're starting like 5 minutes late, we'll just go 5 minutes into the break. So off you.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you all for your patience with me. I'm hoping that the talk will make up for my tardiness. Unsure if that's the case, but let's give it a shot and see what happens. All right. So today's talk, I'm going to have roughly about 6 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current uses of race and ethnicity in the biomedical literature. I'm going to talk about the case study of the United Kingdom. I'll talk about issues and problems, a solution to the issue, which I think would be helpful, and then a little bit of a conclusion to wrap up, and with plenty of time for potentially bad coffee or just fine coffee, and quick Q&A. So let's begin. So in biomedicine, there's been a call for trying to figure out how we ought to better measure concepts of race and ethnicity. And so here are just a couple of examples of recent publications across different contexts that are dealing with how we ought to define race and ethnicity. This one is from Weissman in 2024. This one is from Hicken in 2017, how we ought to measure race or ethnicity in Brazil. Winkler in 2004 and Ma et al. In 2007 have also published publications regarding how we ought to better measure race or ethnicity. And the reason why I wanted to point these out is that this has been more of a long-standing thing in biomedical literature. You can see this happening over the last, like, say, 30 years or so, potentially 35, depending on how far you want to go back on your PubMed search. But these are just a few examples of ways in which the biomedical community has been thinking about how we ought to do this a little bit better. So how ought we to do this a little bit better? I think this is the main question, especially because of its downstream effects on individuals and populations who are marginalized or vulnerable. And historically, in thinking about the practices of biomedicine, that there have been deep injustices done to these groups in very intersectional ways. And so I just want to make sure that this is not excluding that aspect, but even though this is focusing on concepts of race and ethnicity. All right. Let me talk a little bit about the various ways in which race and ethnicity are currently used in the literature to sort of motivate why what's currently happening is an issue. All right, we're going to start in the grand old year of 2002, which is sidebar, which is weird for me to say about like grand old, which means I'm now old. But you know, this is how things go, apparently. In the article by Reich, Bouchard, Ziv, and Boateng, they say the following. They give a classification schema. It says effectively these population genetic studies have recapitulated the classical definition of races based on continental ancestry. And the definitions for those who are further back: Africans, Caucasians, Pacific Islanders, East Asians, and Native Americans. And so one thing that tips me off from my background in sociology is that we have things like classical definition of races, like classical anthropology from like 1950s shows up in my mind, and my alarm bells go off in a major way. But this is 2002. All right, let's continue. In 2005, Neil Reich was interviewed, and Neil Reich said the following regarding race. Well, scientists always happen to disagree about the terminology. A lot of the problem is terminology itself. This emphasis is mine. I'm not even sure what race is. So I want you to hold this in your mind, because for any other sort of like practicing scientists, if they're like, yeah, I'm a physicist, I'm not sure what an atom is. I'm a chemist or chemist. Sidebar, parent brain, I'm tired. I'm a chemist. I don't know what a compound is. I'm an economist. I don't know what an economy is. Something's going to be deeply wrong. Okay. Skip forward to 2015. Banda et al., which includes the authors Boateng and Neil Reich, state the following, that in the paper, participants endorsed any of 23 race, ethnicity, or nationality categories. And the emphasis is mine, so I want to make sure this is pointed out. However, they then were collapsed into seven major race/ethnicity groups. So we've gone from 23 self-identified, or at least 23 from an inductive sense, just aggregating what people happen to say, and they've now collapsed them into 7 major ones. Fantastic, this is 2015. Skip backwards to 2009. Via, Ziv, and Burchard attempted to try to provide some clarity with respect to the use of race or ethnicity in biomedical practice. Here's what they said, and I want to leave this up here as a block quote. I apologize, this is bad presentation skills to leave a block quote, but I thought it's important that you see the whole thing for the reason above. They talked about how their definition of ancestry can be defined on 7 different levels. One is biogeographical, i.e. African versus Asian. The next one is geographical, Southeast Asian versus Northern European, geopolitical, Cambodian versus Swedish, or cultural terms, Jewish versus Berber. Furthermore, ancestry can be defined by one or more multiple sources. How are we going to actually deploy this in biomedical practice? Hold on to the question. The last thing I want to say about the slide is that their attempt is, in some senses, laudable, that they're trying to provide clarity for how this is being done. From my standpoint as a philosopher of science, I don't see any clarity. It's unclear to me that this is any clearer than any of the previous accounts or the ways that it's been used in biomedical practice. Okay. Skip backwards to 2003. There's a method to my madness for why we're going back. Burchard et al., this is in the New England Journal of Medicine, states the following. The classification scheme used in the 2000 census, which is often used in biomedical research, includes 5 major racial groups: Black or African American, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're familiar with the US Census, the pre-2030 census, you got the 5 groups. Ethnic background is a broader construct that takes into consideration culture, tradition, common history, religion, and often a shared genetic heritage. Something's hard here. Something's hard to kind of square the circle. In 2011, Burchard was on the paper and Ziv was on paper by Borrell et al., arguing for the following with respect to race and ethnicity. Although race and ethnicity correlates with genetic ancestry, it captures different information. Race and ethnicity are self-ascribed or socially ascribed entities that are often assigned by police, hospital staff, or others on the basis of physical characteristics. Although race/ethnicity may capture information about the likely presence of certain genetic variants, ancestry is a better predictor. One thing I want to point out is this conceptual slide. It talks about race by itself, but now talking about race/ethnicity as a concept. At no point in any of the articles that Burchard has published have they provided clarity with respect to what these concepts are supposed to refer to. And they're being deployed in technical biomedical contexts. And one way to know that it's being deployed in a technical biomedical context is the fact that it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So as a recap, this is just some of the uses, some. And I think from an inductive standpoint, from a philosopher standpoint, the more you add, the worse it's going to get. Borrell et al. Say that race and ethnicity is something regarding being self-ascribed or socially ascribed, or both. Could be assigned by hospital staff, which you might think is an under researched or under sort of discussed way in which we think about epistemology of biomedical knowledge, what people are bringing to this. Burchard et al. 2003, they said it was the 5 major racial groups. Via et al., self-identified categories, but ancestry is better. Not sure what ancestry is. Banda et al., conflation of race, ethnicity, and nationality. They folded it or collapsed it into 7 major groups out of the 23 that were aggregated in their study. Reich, 2005, nope, no clue what, I have no clue what it means. We're just going to use it anyway. and Reich, 2002, 1950s anthropological racial groups. One thing I want to point out for Reich, and I was trying to finish my slides, he recently won an award by the American Genetics Society or something for like a lifetime achievement award. So he's not a side figure. This is a major person who I, from a sort of like a sociological or I like to try to sometimes aspire to be a historian of biomedical sciences, what I will call the San Francisco Bay Area population biologist group. He's part of this movement. Like he's a central player in this. So let's get to the case study of the UK, because I think if you think it's bad for that stuff, I'm gonna amplify the badness. And I feel like that's bad to say because I'm a parent of a 17-month-old. It's not, I don't want to like make things bad, but I just want to highlight this is not that great. All right, so case study for those who are not familiar, there are 3 ways in which, well, 4-ish, depending on how you take the northern part of Ireland or Northern Ireland, depending on your political leanings. I'm not making a claim. I'm just referencing the fact that people use this kind of language. I'm from the US, as you probably can tell. But there are 3 ways in which census documents or census instruments are deployed. One is the Scottish Census. The other one is Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency, and the Office of National Statistics deploys it for England and Wales. Okay. So in the UK, at least in England and Wales, these are the categories that you happen to get with respect to race or ethnicity. Right? Quite a handful, especially compared to censuses in other geopolitical contexts, especially when you're comparing it to the US, where lots of biomedical research is published and the focus on race is paramount. And in some sense, you might think is hegemonic, given the outsized way in which publications in the US happen to have uptake across the globe. Here is the list of ethnic groups given if you happen to reside in Northern Ireland, slightly less. Here's the one for Scotland. Okay, quite a bit. Here's one thing I think that's really important about this. So we've got 3 different contexts where census instruments deploy schema that are different from each other, which are all, depending on if you're a royalist or Republican, part of the same country. I'm going to slice up political philosophy questions for now. But one thing I want to take is that's really important about this is that these, like the US, play into biomedical practice. And they showed up just like this during times of COVID. This is my form for the vaccination. And I got it, I was like, oh, I have to document this. This is me being like the sociologist, the historian of science. It's current history. I gotta get it before it goes into the memory. This is the schema you got, technically if you were in England, regarding your COVID vaccination. How am I supposed to translate any of those 3 into this? Given, especially so, since technically, if we go back a couple to the UK, none of these really fit. And if you think they might fit, then we can discuss. Okay, let me give a sort of recap of what I take to be some of the issues and problems regarding trying to translate what's going on in the context of the UK into biomedical practice within the UK. And the method for the talk is that if you think it's a problem for the UK, it's going to be a problem writ large. So there are 5 issues and problems that I'm going to be highlighting. One is that there's data churn across measurement instruments. The second is that there are translatability concerns across the 4 nations. The concern about elimination or introduction of classification categories. The methodology for classification of individuals themselves. And the last, which I think in a sense is the most important, is the nesting and conflation of concepts. There's going to be some issues regarding trying to translate what we've got in the UK into something that can be deployed in a consistent way with respect to biomedical practice. Okay. Data tree. Who counts in each category has changed across census instruments. And this is a common thing for all sorts of census instruments, no matter the geopolitical context. Barring as long as they're still taking the census. So for countries like France, where they eliminated the census for political reasons, you're not going to get it, and that's the reason why. So excluding those cases where they just stopped, you have change across census instruments. Given the categories used in census instruments, you get people who move categories across their life course. The issue for this is that if a grouping is small enough, there can be high discrepancies between census snapshots, and that's especially important for minoritized or vulnerable populations. So in the context of the UK, if you think of people who are Roma people, and you have churn, this can have like strong effects on like the population size that is taken as a snapshot. That's problem number one. Problem number two, translatability. Okay, so translatability research is difficult because the methodology for taking census snapshots across all 4 nations have subtle differences in methodology. This is exacerbated by the change of categories used in each census across time. So changes in census and changes in methodology for each individual census. Additionally, the interpretation of census data does not straightforwardly deal with internal migration. And let me sort of make this clear. Imagine, if you will, so let me not use the I. Imagine, if you will, someone who has a parent from Aberdeen and another parent from Carefully, and they live in London, but they were born in Belfast. How ought they to identify with respect to any of these censuses? So internal migration across the 4 countries should be considered. There's something that's exacerbating. Now you might think perhaps this is also a small amount, and perhaps this is a marginal amount. Perhaps, but also for people who happen to be minoritized, Gesundheit, salut, who are minoritized, especially in the context of the UK, where they might have to fit under a mixed category, how they understand their mixedness, which I also think is under sort of like developed in the traditional US sort of like arc of philosophy of race. This is something that needs to be dealt with. Okay. Problem number 3, categories. So the categories have changed across a number of iterations of the census for all 3 of the instruments. Examples of some of the changes include following: the introduction of Roma or showman or showwoman groups, the elimination of 2 standalone categories in the Caribbean or Black group, and then also instruction for who is included in the other ethnic category. And so there are going to be inclusions of different examples for different census instruments. Okay. 4th problem is methodology. And this is in some senses highlighted by Wendy Roth's work, who is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who discusses the ways in which the questions that are asked of people will change the answers that they happen to give regarding their racial or ethnic self-identification. These include things like, what do you see yourself as? What do your friends see you as? What do your parents see you as? When people look at you, what do you think most people think of you as? And so depending on the answer you give, you will get different counts for the same person across iterations of those questions. So that's another thing I want to think about, because these types of questions and the wording and the terminology is important for census instruments themselves. Okay, last is conflation. The categories in the UK census instruments are ethnicities and nationalities, and it says so explicitly. However, the concepts ethnicity and nationality have a very different scope than race concepts. The ethnic categories utilize racial labels underneath them. The nesting of racial groups hierarchically below ethnicities seems to be deeply incorrect. Additionally, the use of national labels under the scope of ethnicity also seems to provide conceptual confusion. It's not clear that you can say that nations are below ethnic groups. Sometimes you have, in the history of the world, had conflation between nation and ethnicity, like the Venn diagram completely overlaps. Sometimes they're below, sometimes they're above. So, it's a mouthful. And it seems like there's a major problem with the UK as a case. Solutions. Let's think about some solutions. Well, I think other accounts fail to work. I think, wait, hold on. I think other accounts fail to work. This is important because, and so these are examples of famous philosophers. You were famous, who argue for a particular type of biological racial realism. I take Andreasen and Kitcher to take a hybrid kind of view, although given Andreasen's spoken statements at the 2008 PSA, Andreasen is a naive realist who is like, I have a bone to pick with their views. And I take it that if you have a hybrid account, but there are problems with biological realism and the problems with social constructionism, and putting stuff together doesn't make it better, it makes it doubly worse. However, for the esteemed philosopher on the left, pre-2009 doesn't work out. I don't think it works out. Starting with tonight, we will have to see. We will have to see, because I think it's important to be charitable because there's new stuff coming down the pipeline. So we just need to see if it's going to work out. No pressure. But I think there's a clear schism at 2009. So pre-2009, pre-2019. Good grief. Pre-2019, Spencer has argued against Spencer's previous views. So it's in print. It's not me. It's in print. So tonight we'll have to see. Okay. So at least this one and those two don't work as examples. I also take it that social constructionist accounts are unable to accommodate the case of the UK. And so these are a number of social constructionists: Esa Diaz-Leon, Chige Jeffers, Sally Haslinger, the late great. I'm trying not to cry, so give me a second. Yes, lots of people who are Charles Mills was really just really kind to me as a person. Jorge Gracia, Linda Martin Alcoff. I take it that their social constructionist accounts are unable to accommodate or explain what's happening in the case study of the UK. So, what works? Voila, I have an answer. And I tried to do this because I thought it would be funny. It didn't work out. We're in the UK. It's fine. The coffee's fine. The joke is fine. Let's continue. But I think that I have a way to provide an answer that accommodates the case of the UK while avoiding what I take to be some of these sort of like pitfalls from some of the particular views that I have highlighted before. So here's what the solution is supposed to look like. There are a number of publications where I'm starting to kind of develop this robust overarching solution. It's to argue for a particular type of metaphysical commitment that doesn't presuppose biological realism, and it doesn't propose a coherent version of social constructionism. The solution that I provide is an anti-realist solution. What this solution entails is an instrumentalist solution, by the way. It entails using the concept of race as a tool, where values are an integral part of the tool, but it rejects realist commitments regarding the concept of race. So downstreams upon empirical research, given my instrumental approach, is that there's better reproducibility, there's non-dogmatic and non-hegemonic claims, there's mitigation of confusion, and most importantly, I think with respect to minoritized or vulnerable populations, there's non-stigmatization of study populations. And you can find a little bit more about this in Sean Bias's work regarding the ways in which race or ethnic concepts can be used to stigmatize people. For vulnerable populations or populations who are trying as a biomedical practice to reach out to them and to mitigate health disparities, which I take that everyone in this room thinks is bad. There's going to be someone on my slide who I'm not sure does, but we'll continue to, as a foreshadowing, we'll continue that. But I think that's an important downstream effect for having this particular kind of instrumental or anti-realist kind of stance. Okay. Here's some historical examples for why you might think an anti-realist approach is the way to go. This is taken from census.gov. This is the history up to 2010 of all the different sort of categories that one can identify as. Sorry, I'm going to back it up. These are all the categories that have been deployed in the US Census. Self-identification pretty much only came about 1970, if I remember, was the first year. Okay. Here's an example that
Can you, sorry, we can't read what's in the boxes. Can you tell us roughly what purple, red, blue, green, that's separated?
I absolutely will, because I'm going to zoom in.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. No, this is important because you're like, oh my gosh, really? Wall of text. Bad presentation. But I want to zoom in on this particular point right here. And so for those of you at home or online, we've got 1910, 1930, and 1950. We've got, and I want to highlight these three areas of the census. In 1910, it was Chinese and Japanese. In 1930, it was Chinese, Filipino, Hindu, Japanese, and Korean for Asian. And then 1950 was Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese. What happened to the Koreans?
With these examples or meant to be the names of the category?
These are the names of the categories.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's not, Asian, I mean, there is some examples.
Right. I'm using the term Asian because the color coding is supposed to, in some senses, the census has tried to like fit it into what was currently happening in, like, say, 2010.
And so Indian presumably does not mean Indian here is not Indian subcontinent Indian, but what we now think is Native American.
That's
Is that right?
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
That's cool. Because, and you might think that that's also important. I just want to highlight these three, but there are lots of ways in which you think the terminology itself will actually then invoke, yes, now I see myself as part of this group. I do assent to this. So on the top, it says Indian for 1910, 1930, and then 1950, it then moves to American Indian, which you might still think doesn't get people, like, I'm a native and I have this tribe and etc. But I think that is also underutilized. And I take the point in line of like Kim Tallbear's work, etc., that are focusing on those kind of issues. This one, we've got Black or Negro or mulatto, and then that's gone. What I really want to highlight is 1930, is that it's the only appearance of the race Mexican. That's it. It's gone. And so what I take to be really problematic is that any biological realist view pre-2019 seems to have difficulty dealing with this as a racial group. And I think social constructionists might have an issue with this as well, because the category has gone, it's disappeared. Showed up in 1 year, then it's gone. Okay. No more historical evidence for why I think the anti-realist instrumental approach is the way to go. Okay, this is taken from Joel Perlman's book, America Classifies the Immigrants. And this is a list from 1904. And this is the list of races and peoples. So this is part of it. This is the other part of it. And this is the last part of it. Any sort of like social scientist or demographer really enjoys that last category on the far right, all other peoples. I take that this is a historical fact. So if you have biological racial realist accounts or social constructionist accounts that try to use institutions or the instruments that are deployed from them as evidence supporting their views, this seems like it's going to be hard to accommodate. Gary Gerstl's book, which is also written around this time, also provides other historical evidence for showing that this is going to be a problem. Okay, since I'm not hegemonic as an individual or as an institution, we should look at other places around the globe. Let's do so. This is taken from Mara Loveman's book, National Colors, which is a survey of 16 or 17 Latin American countries. My math might be off by like ±3, which is what? 10% confidence interval? Not great. I'm tired. That's okay. But this is supposed to this is supposed to demonstrate the years in which races were asked on national census across the Latin American context. If you are a biological racial realist, you think that institutions or the labels that are used in those instruments are important, pre-2019, you should also be able to accommodate this information. And the same thing if you're a social constructionist. You should be able to deal with this. Not only should you be able to deal with historical stuff, you should be able to deal with forward-facing things as well. This is taken from the University of California, where the category that you can now pick your name on if you're applying to any of the UC systems, we have a category called MENA, and the purported category, the proposed category is SWANA. MENA is supposed to capture Middle East and North Africa. Why SWANA? Well, my thought is you should read your Edward Said, because it's Southwest Asia and North Africa. We should avoid the vestiges of Orientalism. One thing that is important about both of this is that the list of countries for both is different. So it's some iteration of the schema for University of California. If you take off MENA and they're like, look, we got it wrong. Those wacko kids at Berkeley, where I went, they're like, we got to get SWANA in there. They get SWANA in. This now changes things. Biological racial realists and social constructionists should be flexible enough to deal with historical evidence and future differences in racial groups. Last is that there's increased importance for dealing with this with respect to biomedical practice, given that AI is now ubiquitous in lots of ways across lots of biomedical contexts. And we should be doing something rather than re-entrenching racial or ethnic discrimination. We should be doing better, not necessarily everyone in the room, but as an epistemic body or as a collective, we should be doing better on this. So one thing I also want to point out is that an instrumentalist or anti-realist approach avoids ascribing particular diseases or ailments to groups based upon mistaken understandings of populations, biological or otherwise. Question for you all: how are you doing on time? Because I haven't.
That's a great question. You've been about half an hour. You spent half.
Great, fantastic. Good. I've got less than 15 minutes to go. I also think that it's important that my instrumentalist account is able to be deployed, particularly with respect to biomedical instruments and technology, because there are current sort of trends in which we're trying to get rid of the biases that have shown up in medical instruments themselves, which I also think is really important. So things like the spirometer, things like algorithms for like renal function or heart function, with respect to things like bone density calculators, lots of these things where AI is now like built in. There are movements to try to get this stuff out. I recommend reading Dorothy Roberts' work, Laura Benjamin's work. I think there are plenty of scholars who really trying to bring this to the fore, and it's now starting to kind of like make a bit of a groundswell. Okay, another positive about taking my account is that you can avoid these kinds of situations. And if you haven't read Nick Wade's book, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't. In some senses, it's like when I teach Kant. It's like, here what Kant has to say about races. I'm not endorsing this, but it's out there in the literature. So that's the thing. Do you not know about Kant says about races? You do.
Just start, right? I mean, it's roughly a part of what he said about women.
I mean, it's weird, right?
Okay, so
Yeah. It's like, look, there's this thing, Yeah, but I think you with an anti-realist approach that doesn't take these deep biological commitments in ways that the members of the general public will take conceptual, like technical concepts and then massage them into whatever they happen to like. You avoid having this sort of like theoretical sort of like support for this kind of thing. You also avoid theoretical support for something that just happened in the news in the last week. My tip for everyone at home: do not send your swab in. Just don't do it. Where racist scientists, and I use both in quotation marks, who have a history of being connected to KCL pre-COVID in 2016 and other sorts of eugenicist conferences, which in some sense is ironic and yet not, given that it's KCL. I mean, sorry, it's UCL. My apologies. It's
Oh,
UCL. Sorry.
This is problematic.
Sorry. At UCL, they
UCL.
had eugenicists conferences, which then went underground. They're back above ground.
Hmm.
They're back. They've never gone away. One also thing that is important, because I am a member of the faculty at Cambridge HPS. I'm not saying this because I'm trying to mic drop, but I think it's important that I say that my view, an anti-realist view, helps you undermine this kind of stuff. And so if you don't happen to know about this particular person, because I'm not even going to say their name.
Yeah.
And I leave this up there because this is what they said in public, or this is what they said in print. And especially if they're worried about free speech. Well, let's put your speech up there because it's free. My particular kind of view helps you run contrary to this kind of stuff, which I think is deeply important, and which I think in some senses has not been said enough. It also, and just to think that if you think that this has gone away, it hasn't. This person just gave a talk at Stanford. And so this thing is on the rise again. And so I think it's important. So this is not just a philosophical issue where it's like we're having in sort of like an intramural discussion about like philosophy of race. And I mean this with respect to everyone, but rather there's some real heft behind this. And so I think that adopting the sort of solution that I happen to have helps to really push back against this kind of stuff, because it's on the rise, and depending on how things go next week, could be rising even further. So, in conclusion, the following points should be taken from this talk. There might be others, but at least you should, hopefully you got this from me. Is that A, the concepts of race and ethnicity are both disordered concepts. There's not really clear sort of like hierarchical understandings regarding the two. Failure to address the foundational issues regarding both of those concepts will continue to have deleterious consequences in biomedical practice. And my solution is possible that it is both theoretically sufficient and practically implementable. I think having an anti-realist approach is a way that we can still do work in biomedicine without avoiding sort of like the trappings of like racism or other sorts of like oppressions that happen to be intersectional. And I am looking forward to hearing your questions. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate that.
Questions? Okay, Alex, your hand was straight up.
It's not that anyway. I just put my hand up. It wasn't like I'm like desperate to, this was really, really fascinating. I really enjoyed the examples and the analysis. So thank you. I have a bunch of questions, but like I'm wondering about one of the most recent things you said, which was this kind of strategies for addressing racialism, I guess, is a sort of and I guess my view is that the answer to such questions of the best strategy is probably ultimately empirical. But here's a kind of general consideration that something more along realist, perhaps more along Quaishon's lines, or a kind of pluralism within that context might be better placed to address racialist views, which is that there's a sense in which one's denying obvious intuitions by saying, or certain kinds of intuitions that are pretty widespread, by suggesting that race isn't real. So it is the case that one can walk into, say, this room and have a very, very good guess just by looking at people. You can even, abstract away from what people are wearing or their attitude, anything else, and work out what race people are likely to self-identify with. That seems to be just a commonplace understanding, and most people are aware of this fact. It seems that one's doing some kind of violence to common ways of speaking and such intuitions if you fail to account for that. Now, it might well be, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how it is that your instrumentalism can take seriously this notion that there is something physically observable, genetically heritable, distinct between different people. So, like, my thought is that perhaps, and again, as I said, I think this is empirical, perhaps a better way to address the kind of, I know you said, didn't want to say his name, but Koffner's type views, for example, is to say, let's accept and take very seriously and be totally honest about the fact that there are these differences between people and they're heritable and they allow us more or less to identify or to guess what people's race identification is. But then also clearly, straightforwardly, honestly, and in detail articulate the kinds of social mechanisms that lead to the social construction of such pretty irrelevant, very, very superficial, very, very small part of the genome differences between peoples that are then taken up by certain kinds of colonial and historical mechanisms to lead to the kinds of educational health disparities that we observe. And it seems to me like it's at least conceivable or plausible, maybe stronger, to that kind of maybe thin realism will allow one to better, take people with you rather than seeming to deny a bunch of pretty commonplace intuitions. Maybe that was more a statement, for which I apologize. What do you think of that?
No, so
it's a really, really bad way to ask a question, so I'm really sorry. But yeah.
You should, so because I enjoy reading Foucault, I'm gonna take the power that I have, given that I'm standing here, and I will wield it in the style of Wittgenstein. It's okay. There's no need to have it be like perfectly gilded and come out of the mouth in like a very excellent way, or at least how you might take it to be excellent. I understand what you have to say. And for anyone else who asks questions, please take your time. It's okay. So here's what I'm taking from both of my thing that, and do let me know if this is not, if I'm missing something. I take it that it's really important the ways in which how people describe themselves. And so when I put a star next to like ways in which we do violence for failing to take people with us, given that they come with particular schema or sort of like concepts about how they identify. Yes, I agree, absolutely correct. So I want to avoid that, and I think my approach can do so. And the other aspect of sort of like having a thin realism, and yet still have it in a very like pluralistic way. Yeah, it might do this, but there's the other things, and there's lots of like all sorts of like, if you take sort of like perhaps like a causal historical picture, there's a lot of vectors that are like leading up to like this point in time, and depending on like your strength, etc., they all show up, right? Like, fine. I take both of these things seriously. I think that part of having an instrumentalist account is to separate how people self-describe or racial identification with the use of race in technical scientific contexts. Here's the sort of like some examples from sort of like that I was really like thinking about this when I was reading Putnam. So like when you think about like jade, and jade is two separate things, like jadeite and nephrite. Or we think about things like, hey, a whale used to be thought of as a fish. Lo and behold, voila, it's not a fish. Like, what do we do with a duck-billed platypus, right? Like these kind of, like those kind of things. I take it that if with enough sort of like general like philosophy PR, or just PR, if you think philosophy PR is going to tank the project to begin with, because philosophers are bad at PR. Enough PR to be like, look, we separate these two things. How people racially identify, in some senses, in like from philosophy of language, like loose speak or like everyday discourse, is going to be different from the use of these concepts in technical discourse. And so if we're an instrumentalist, sure, we take, in some sense, we aggregate based on what people's are bringing to the table. We're not making a commitment as being like these things are real. In the same way that we can still do interventions, even if we take it that the thing is not in some senses existing. So there's placebo effects, there's nocebo effects. And for those of you, because I deploy this because I'm in the UK, have people read Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Great. I'm one of the few people in the world who's never read Harry Potter, nor seen any of the films. But I know that there are houses, right? One is like Gryffindor or something like that.
Gryffindor.
Great, fantastic, yeah. See, now people are now. See, this is good. Well, good. This is good. This is great. This is participant observation. Like I've now like deployed this intervention in a very sociological kind of way, and I've gotten the response that I wanted. People can get deeply upset about concepts that don't actually refer to the empirical world. There's no Gryffindorf in the empirical world. Go ahead, go to King's Cross, go to station 9 3/4, stand in front, take pictures. There's a thing, there's a shopping cart that's in the wall. Have you seen this? Hugh?
Yeah.
You ever seen this? At King's Cross, because there was apparently like Harry Potter was supposed to be like going to wherever Griffin, I don't know. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But the way to do that is like you had to have this special kind of thing, like an X-Men. You had to have like a special thing, and then only you and the other people who had it could see the station. So there's a station 9 3/4 where you can head off this thing. The station, it doesn't exist. In the empirical world, it doesn't exist. The magic where you buy, you can go to the little shop next door and get the little twig that's supposed to, you incant something and then like stuff is supposed to fly out. It doesn't exist. Now, if you want to have if we want to have battles about, and I prefer not have battles, if we want to have like really like deep discussions about the metaphysics of fictional objects, yes, we can do that. But that seems even farther removed. Like that's even farther away from an instrumental account than just being like, look, we take it that this is how you self-describe. It doesn't really work out. But I think there's a way, and I want to be respectful of the fact that other people want to ask questions. There's a way to respect the schema that people come with, and yet still separate it from technical context and deploy that in technical context, where we understand that any sort of instrument that we happen to use for things like public health or epidemiology never gets 100% yield. But we can still deploy it. We still make interventions, even if we take from a metaphysical standpoint, the thing does not refer. It doesn't exist. Does that help to answer your question?
I have a response, I think.
Great.
Yeah,
Good
Krayshawn
answer.
had a finger, so Krayshawn, and then I think for the sake of time, we'll move on. I think it was Joanna, and then I think it's Arjun, and then Jim.
I'll bring up I'm speaking next, so
Okay, well, we'll
I'll
leave you
address
out then.
that.
Krayshawn.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Love the stuff. Love the slide of the Quayshawn is wrong. Actually, I did that to Paul Taylor when I was a junior scholar, so everything comes around.
No, I said, I didn't say Quayshawn wrong. I said the view pre-2019.
That's right. That's right.
I-
It's the early, see, that's what you have to do.
There's a difference between, and I'm not sure that there is, but we will see.
But let's get to the meta stuff, because
Yeah.
the way that I've previously understand, this is an extension of your dissertation, right? Your work was kind of agnostic, not anti-realist. And what was interesting about it was you're kind of putting it's looked like to me, you're putting yourself kind of in the same sort of path as people like Kofi Maglo. Let's focus on what's useful. Let's stop talking about what's objectively real, what's not objectively real. And kind of in the same vein as if we go back to Pierre Duhem, people attribute the term instrumentalism to him, but but that was kind of in the same spirit of let's stop talking about whether our scientific theories are latching onto objective reality or not. But he did have a notion of truth, and there was a sense in which you could say he's kind of like I think the term like thin realism or something was used over here, which would now more correspond to something like Arthur Fine's non-realism, scientific non-realism, something like that, or natural ontological attitude, which is, I mean, if you're going to use variables and they're actually doing causal work, it's got to be, what you're picking out, it's got to exist. But you could just sort of sidestep the issue of whether it objectively exists or something like that. It's like, well, this is just a thinner notion, something like that. It's what's useful in biomedical research or something like that. And he kind of like or at least it's the earlier, see, I'm gonna try to, the earlier Hunter, sidestep the whole issue about, you know, is race some kind of is it like subspecies or something like that? Or does it not exist like Appia is talking about? Like, we don't need to get into all that. We just, you know, what are the useful ways of sort of carving up the world? But now it looks like you're going in a stronger direction. You're talking about, you know, fictional objects, racist fictional objects, which it becomes a little more difficult to square with, you know, the utility of the groups, because how can you use things that don't exist? So, you know, I'm just wondering, are you using the term anti-realism in a special way? Or are you trying to step into this metaphysical literature and make a contribution there that then gets used in the biomedical context? Like, 'cause I mean, Appia, it's early Appia. Everybody changes their mind. Early Appia, like race is like witch, you know, it doesn't exist. There's nothing you can do with something that doesn't exist. But do you really want to do it? Like, it seems like you can get everything you want with just kind of the agnostic route.
Yeah, I've got the long story is that I think I've held on to these kind of like in the process of getting a dissertation, which I took the advice is like the best dissertation is a completed dissertation. In the sort of like auspices of like doing like, because I trust the person who was my dissertation supervisor like wholeheartedly. I need to do this. And so I think that there are aspects where, because I want to be deeply charitable to the person. I think there are things that might have been like itches for me that were like, yeah, you know what, like, let's really focus on how this can be used. Maybe I can size up some of these questions. I think from an iterative standpoint, like looking at a number of these examples, I think perhaps from like an IBE, like the best inference that we can make given all the sort of historical evidence is that you could either be like, everyone's deeply confused about race or ethnicity and we're waiting for the next best thing. Or if you do that and you do that plus inductive skepticism, we've had all this evidence and we're getting it wrong every single time. We might think that the best thing to say is that it's just not real. I was thinking about working on a book on this. And so this is to be like, I've talked to OUP and I said, look, I'm thinking about doing something like metaphysics of race, like standard analytic canonical metaphysics, because it's a thing that has just been kind of like hanging around that I haven't had the space to really kind of like deploy. It could be the case that it fails, which I think will also be a very important thing to publish, to be like, look, I tried this, it's anti-realist, it fails. Maybe we just need to be a thin realist. Maybe that's the way to go. And if so, fine. And how do I like work my current stuff around to also still deploy it in non-racist or anti-oppressive kind of ways? So in the style of the slide, see me in 2029 when OUP has gone through the editing process, and then, you know, the book is out and then we have a chat. But I think it's a deeply important question, because if I'm going to go down this road, I have a lot of work to do to really like carve out the space. And I'm not naive enough nor arrogant enough to think like I have an answer literally right now. Is that helpful to answer your question? Okay.
I think there's another finger on this point.
Thank you. So I have like 8 or 9 questions. Thank you very much. I'm not asking 8 or 9 questions, but I am starting there because it would be my preference to ask you some clarification questions about a number of things, not just the slides, before like wondering in a more critique negative type way. So just for the purposes of conversation, a question, and I think I think there's more than one essence in your presentation. But if I now make that a singular, the essence of much of what you say, I'm really interested in. But I'm wondering 2 things. Taking a word concept from theology, apophatic, is there a sense in which, and this ties to your question, ways in which you are conceiving anti-realism, and separate to that, the prospect of that which is, or may be taken to be, anti-realist. So I'm deep dive into language at this moment. If anti-realism does that binary thing of apophatically, constructing its own identity in relation to some versions, multiple necessarily, epistemically diverse versions of what realism is and what they take to be not, then what we have is less an actual constructive position and more something that has the look and feel as a word concept of a constructive position that is potentially going to struggle to withstand multiple versions of the charge, that it is nothing more than a word concept that referencing some kind of unregulated or occasionally better regulated aggregation of things that are arguably nothing more than short-scale disavowals of realism. A problem that immediately presents itself that I also think I'm discerning here, and I'm saying this kindly, is that there is the real risk of representations of what are taken to be realist positions, which suffer from the challenge of category, and then potentially from aspects of misrepresentation. And in a sense, I think aspects of Spencer pre-2019 have pointed to things which are moving towards what we're going to hear tonight, where I think the monist aspect of what he's pointing at has been inhering in what he's been saying in his disavowal of its construction, it's biological. So have we got warrant to be sure that what is being represented and then disavowed has, in fact, been epistemologically as well as epistemically adequately represented? Last thing for now, thank you so much. The claim that anti-realism instrumentally, it's a tie. The claim that anti-realism will necessarily achieve what you say at this moment doesn't have any instrumental practical evidence. So I'd love an example in medical healthcare where you can genuinely show that anti-realism will do what you say it must be able to do, even though your caveat just now is very important.
Fantastic. I'm gonna try to answer them briefly in turn. With respect to the first one, I'm gonna, in some senses, sort of reiterate the thought regarding Quayshawn's work, is that there's a lot of work needing to be done regarding representation. The concerns that what I am providing as a representation of anti-realism might not capture everything. There's a lot of work and that's why I was thinking about building this book in order to deal with the sort of things that you both are bringing. There's just a lot of work that will have to do this. This is, like I said, it's been a bit of an itch. It's been a thing I've been really I feel pulled or moved in this direction to say it's anti-realist. Perhaps I shouldn't and just say, look, we should just be instrumentalists about it. Perhaps so. But I think, and that avoids concerns about representation. It avoids concerns about how can I talk about the thing that is not real. There's clear, in some sense, set theoretical sort of paradoxes or puzzles that I have to fully work out on a metaphysical standpoint to bolster the case. I think there are a number of examples in healthcare where when we abandoned the thought that race was something biologically real, that it ended up working out for lots of people. We might think in the ways in which in some instances in the history of medicine, contemporarily, the use of race correction in algorithms, in spirometers, in renal function, et cetera. Those are clearances and there's empirical work now, I think there's something published in Cell or the American Journal of Public Health that show that statistically speaking, when you remove race, it's still, the instrument can still function just as well as it did beforehand. So I think there's an example. If we take it that race in a naive sense was imbued with some sort of biological differences between groups, well, we should, from a political philosophy of health, we should think about things like the Puerto Rican birth control trials, zoom out things in which like Guatemalans who were subjected to syphilis before that were used as the justification for the Tuskegee experiments. Like there are all sorts of like ways in which that when we abandon these sort of like these naive understandings of race and the differences that they happen to have, we get better outcomes, especially for those groups that have been minoritized or done wrong across the history of biomedicine. Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, so just thank you for your presentation. I really like it. And I will probably sound like a cocky asshole, but I really think it would be, you can benefit of reading some of my articles about it, because I totally do very like work in line in what you were saying. So I can just like, probably if I were you, I would focus more on dividing some of the problems you are describing. So for example, the subject of the presentation was the use of the ethno-racial categories in genetics and genomics, and then we are skipping from like design of some kind of medical equipment and category of race as a self-identified ethno-racial affiliation and research on racism and so on. So I think it's a bit of like, you know, chaotical to talk about all of it, while I would love to hear more about your solution, what kind of classifications you would like to see in genomic and genetic research. You showed this like very long list of different nations. I was like wondering how that was produced. Like there were Slovaks, but not Czech people and so on. And when it comes to genetic and genomic research, generally, I like digging into like that kind of research. I really believe that researchers move on. So they generally don't use ethno-racial categorizations proposed by different institutions like UK Census or OMB into different classifications. So yeah, they are generally less and less realists about race themselves, I suppose. So how would you like to address it in your proposal?
So the first thing I will absolutely take the articles. If there are things that everyone has that is like, look, you should probably read this. I think from an epistemic standpoint, I should do it as a scholar. Like, I just need to read it then. Like, just read it. Like, just get into it. Because I think it's important. And I think that in some sense, it's reflected in the sort of stuff that I tried to generate as evidence, stuff from political science, stuff from the history, some from like the use of like census instruments, some from different like global contexts. I take it, I'm trying to, from my standpoint as a scholar, move in a direction that I find to be out of the sort of like arc that I found to be like the Ernst Mayr sort of classification or the Andreasen style. Like it's very, especially with respect to races in the US, it's been pretty much like just about the US. And I know David Aiken's work in Australia. I know that Adam Hockman's work. There are other people's work across global contexts. Saperstein's work in sociology regarding like concepts like mixedness, mixed race, and sort of like Theas and others, those people, Monia Silva, like all sorts of people I have something to say with philosophical input. And so if you have something, I welcome it. Please send it to me and I will read it and I will take it in. The classification question, how would I like it to be utilized? I think there's, and so this is also going to, I'm hoping I'm pitching a second book to OUP regarding like actually how this going to work out in practice. And the long story short is that there are going to need to be intertranslatability rules for like supranational organizations, like WHO or other sort of things that deal with pandemics. So that way they can accommodate the fact that schema used in the UK are going to be different from schema used in Canada, which are going to be different from schema used in, say, Peru, whilst also holding that for any social scientific instrument that arguably, and I probably make an argument, that arguably has that deals with a sample that is larger than one, you're never going to get 100% yield. And
To get into those regulations that function in like global databases for genetic data, would they have their own like considerations?
we need to talk. Then, and I don't mean as a, like, but I need the info. Like, you got to tell me, please.
I think we've run over quite a lot, so I'm going to leave you two to talk over some bad coffee. Sorry to miss the question online, but let's thank our speaker.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.